In the summer of 1944, Allied forces pushed deep into occupied Europe, striving to break the German hold after the D-Day landings. Small units frequently operated behind enemy lines, tasked with critical missions like delivering orders, scouting enemy positions, and linking frontline elements. These operations were far from routine. The dense hedgerows of Normandy, the muddy fields, and the unpredictable weather created a labyrinthine battlefield where visibility was limited and danger lurked unseen. Communication lines were fragile, and a single misstep, no matter how small, could expose a unit to deadly ambushes. This story centers on one such patrol, made up of disciplined but unheralded soldiers, whose routine task became a desperate fight for survival when a quiet mistake threatened to unravel everything. Their experience exemplifies the razor-thin margins on which so many lives hung in World War II's most brutal campaigns. And no one heard the mistake when it happened. There was no crack of gunfire to announce it, no sudden scream, no flare in the sky. It was the kind of error that could slip into a war the way cold slips into your bones, quietly, patiently, and then all at once. The men in the small Allied unit moved through the dim afternoon like shadows with rifles, their boots sinking into wet earth that smelled of rot and churned grass. Somewhere ahead, the line between safety and enemy ground was not marked by flags or fences, but by instinct, by rumor, by the way birds stopped calling when too many men passed beneath the trees. Their mission had been routine on paper: carry sealed orders forward, confirm a set of positions, and return before nightfall swallowed the landscape whole. The kind of task that didn't earn medals, only fatigue. The soldier at the center of it was not the kind of man who drew stories toward himself. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He didn't have the careless confidence of someone who believed the war would always bend away from him at the last second. He was competent, steady, and mostly invisible, exactly the kind of soldier officers relied on when they wanted something done without drama. His uniform sat neatly despite days in the field, his kit strapped down tight, his weapon cleaned whenever there was a spare moment. Even his face seemed built for discipline, plain, weathered, and unreadable except for the tiredness that sat behind his eyes like a permanent bruise. Men like him were the spine of an army. They didn't shine, but they held. The unit moved in a narrow file along a hedgerow that rose thick and tangled, branches slick with moisture. It was late in the war, late enough that everyone knew what an ambush looked like even before it happened. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, and the sky hung low and gray, pressing down like a lid. Visibility was poor, not because of fog exactly, but because the world itself seemed muted, colors washed out, distances uncertain. A farmhouse in the distance looked abandoned, but abandoned places could still hide eyes. A stand of trees looked harmless, but trees had sheltered machine guns before. Each step was measured. Each pause was deliberate. The men spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, and even then their words felt like something that didn't belong out here. They were carrying a message that mattered, even if the men carrying it weren't important. Orders in wartime were like blood in a body, invisible until the moment they stopped moving. The sealed packet was tucked inside a waterproof pouch, and it was treated with a respect that had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with what paper could do to living men. The mission required them to check in with a forward element that had shifted positions overnight. The front was never static. It breathed, contracted, and expanded, and sometimes units disappeared into the folds without anyone noticing until it was too late. The small team had been told to confirm the location, deliver the orders, and come back. Simple. Clean. A job for men who wouldn't complicate it. The soldier walked near the front, not leading in rank, but leading in reliability. He kept his eyes moving, ditch lines, gaps in hedges, broken fence posts that could mark a path or a trap. He watched the men behind him too, the way their shoulders sagged, the way their hands gripped rifles a little tighter whenever the terrain opened up. Everyone was tired. Not just tired in the body, but tired in the mind, the kind of fatigue that made the world feel slightly unreal. In that condition, mistakes didn't come from stupidity. They came from being human. The procedural slip happened at a stop that lasted less than a minute. The unit paused in a shallow depression, a place where the ground dipped just enough to hide them from the nearest rise. The sergeant checked a map against the compass, tracing a line with a gloved finger. The soldier reached into his pocket for a small folded card, one of those field aids that told you what you already knew, but could save your life when stress scrambled your memory. Authentication codes. Recognition signals. The dull mechanics of survival. His fingers were stiff from cold, and the paper was damp. He glanced at it, then tucked it away. And in that small movement, something was wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It was the absence of a final check, the kind of check you skipped when you were sure you'd already done it. The soldier had been responsible for ensuring the unit's temporary identification marker was set correctly, a strip of cloth used for recognition in the low light, a subtle sign to friendly patrols that you weren't the enemy creeping forward. It was supposed to be fixed in a specific way, visible only from certain angles, a compromise between being seen by friends and not being seen by foes. In the rush to move out, in the numbness of cold fingers and the pressure of time, it had been adjusted incorrectly. Not missing. Not blatant. Just wrong enough. They moved again, slipping out of the depression and following a narrow track that curved between hedges. The world around them seemed unchanged. No sudden movement. No crack of rifles. The soldiers' breathing steadied. The mission felt like it was returning to its predictable rhythm. But war did not punish mistakes with immediate honesty. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it let you walk deeper before it closed the door behind you. The first sign that something had shifted was not an enemy soldier stepping into view. It was a silence that didn't belong. Birds had been scarce all day, but now even the distant rustle of small animals seemed to fade. The men felt it more than they heard it, the way you feel pressure in the air before a storm breaks. The soldier's eyes went to the hedgerow, to the gaps where branches formed dark holes. He scanned the line of earth where roots lifted and fell. Nothing. Still nothing. But his stomach tightened anyway, a cold knot forming under the ribs. They reached a crossroads where two dirt paths met, both bordered by thick vegetation. The sergeant raised a hand, halting them. He looked down at the map again, then up at the landscape, trying to reconcile paper with reality. The soldier took a knee automatically, rifle angled toward the nearest opening. He could smell damp soil and the faint metallic scent of oil from his weapon. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, but it was not close enough to be comforting. It only reminded them the war was bigger than this little path, bigger than their little group, and just as indifferent. A faint sound came then, soft, almost nothing. The snap of a twig, perhaps. The soldier's head turned sharply. He held his breath. The men behind him shifted, boots scraping lightly. The sergeant hissed a warning to stay still. They froze in place, bodies tense, eyes searching. The sound did not repeat. The woods returned to quiet. But the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That somewhere, unseen, a set of eyes had tracked them not as a passing patrol, but as a target. They pushed on, because stopping too long in one place was its own danger. The path narrowed and dipped again, and the hedges grew taller, creating a tunnel of green and brown. Their boots made wet sounds with each step. The soldier kept counting distances in his mind, checking landmarks against what he remembered from briefings. Something didn't line up. The forward element they were supposed to meet should have been closer by now. Either the unit had moved again, or the map was outdated, or they had drifted off course. He felt a flicker of irritation at himself for not insisting on another check earlier. Small doubts were dangerous, because they multiplied. Then, ahead, he saw it, something subtle, almost invisible unless you were trained to notice the wrongness of ordinary things. A thin wire, stretched low across the path, half buried in mud and leaves. Tripwire. The kind that didn't exist in friendly ground. His heart slammed hard enough to hurt. He lifted his hand quickly, fist closed, the signal to stop. The men behind him halted instantly, their discipline saving them from stepping forward into death. The soldier leaned closer, eyes narrowing. The wire ran toward the hedgerow, disappearing into a tangle of roots and shadow. It wasn't an old wire. It wasn't rusted. It was fresh, placed with care. He swallowed, throat suddenly dry. This wasn't a random hazard. It was a warning. A sign that someone expected movement here. The sergeant crept up beside him, face pale beneath grime. He followed the wire with his gaze, then looked ahead, scanning the hedges. No enemy appeared. No gunfire erupted. But the presence of that wire changed everything. It meant the ground in front of them was not simply contested, it was prepared. And prepared ground meant the enemy was close enough to shape the battlefield. The soldier's mind raced backward through the last few minutes, searching for the moment when the world had tilted without them noticing. He thought of the identification marker, the slight wrongness of it, the skip check. He imagined a friendly patrol spotting them and hesitating, unsure, losing precious seconds. He imagined an enemy patrol seeing the same thing and deciding they were worth following. A small mistake, quiet and harmless in the moment, now felt like a hand pushing them forward into a trap. They backed away from the wire carefully, one slow step at a time, trying not to disturb the ground. The soldier's pulse hammered in his ears. His fingers tightened on the rifle stock until they ached. The air felt colder now, sharper, as if the land itself had become hostile. Behind them, the path they had come from seemed suddenly too long, too exposed. Ahead, the hedges waited like walls. The unit was still alive, still moving, still technically on mission, but the routine had evaporated. Something unseen had shifted around them, and they were inside it now, walking through a danger they did not yet fully understand. They withdrew from the tripwire as if the air itself might detonate. Each man moved with the careful stiffness of someone carrying a glass of water across a floor littered with nails, heel placed down softly, weight transferred slowly, rifles kept level but not waving. The hedgerows pressed in tight on either side, damp leaves brushing shoulders, and the narrow track behind them looked suddenly unfamiliar, as if the land had shifted while they weren't watching. The soldier's eyes stayed fixed on the ground where the wire disappeared into roots. He felt the prickling heat of fear under his collar despite the cold, and he tried to breathe without noise, drawing air through his nose in shallow pulls that tasted of wet soil and decaying vegetation. The sergeant's face was close enough to see the strain in it, the slight tremor at the corner of his mouth, as he listened for any sign that they had been noticed. Nothing came immediately. That was what made it worse. In training, danger arrived with sound, shouts, shots, explosions, something you could react to with your hands and legs. Here, the danger sat silent, letting imagination fill the gaps. The unit crouched in the shallow depression again, using the dip in the earth to hide their outlines. The soldier checked his weapon by feel, thumb brushing the safety, fingers confirming the magazine seated properly. The metal was cold and slick, a familiar weight that steadied him. He could hear the small sounds of the others, a man swallowing, another shifting his knee in mud, a suppressed cough that sounded too loud in the stillness. The sergeant leaned over the map again, but the map no longer felt like a tool. It felt like a suggestion. They had to decide whether to turn back the way they came or try to bypass the wire through the hedgerow. Either option carried risk. The path behind them might already be observed, and the enemy might be waiting for exactly that retreat. The hedgerow, thick with thorns and hidden ditches, could slow them down and break their formation, turning them into separated targets. The soldier watched the sergeant's eyes move across the paper, then lift to the terrain, then back down again, as if he could force certainty into existence by repeating the motion. The soldier knew the sergeant was thinking the same thing he was. This wasn't just a random trap. It was placed with intent. Someone expected movement here. They tried to send a brief recognition signal toward the direction of friendly lines, a small method used by patrols to avoid friendly fire and confirm identity without shouting into the open. A hand signal, a subtle movement of cloth, a practice rhythm that meant everything in the half-light. The soldier felt his stomach drop when there was no response. It wasn't that silence automatically meant the worst. Radios failed. Men missed signals. The wind carried sound away. But in the field, uncertainty itself was a threat. When a signal didn't return, it left a hole where reassurance should have been, and that hole filled quickly with fear. They moved again, not forward toward the wire but sideways, angling into a patch of scrub and low trees that offered concealment. The soldier led the careful crawl, pushing branches aside with the back of his hand, avoiding snapping twigs. The ground was uneven, and every few feet his boots slid on slick leaves. He could feel the strain in his calves and the ache in his lower back, the dull protest of a body that had been marching and crouching for too many days. Above them, the sky stayed low and heavy, and the light seemed to drain away faster than it should have, as if the afternoon was being pulled toward night by an unseen hand. It was there, in that slow sideways movement, that the consequences began to reveal themselves in small, cruel pieces. The soldier caught a glimpse of motion through the hedgerow ahead, too low to be a bird, too steady to be wind. He froze, raising his hand, and the men behind him stopped in the same instant, their discipline as tight as a wire. Through the branches, he saw the faint shape of a helmet and the darker block of a rifle. The figure was distant, partially hidden, but it was moving with purpose along a parallel line, tracking the same terrain. The soldier's mouth went dry. Enemy movement where there shouldn't be any. He didn't fire. Firing would have announced them, and a single shot could pull the whole world down on their heads. He held still, watching, trying to measure the distance and direction. The figure passed, then another, both moving in a way that suggested patrol rather than panic. They weren't running. They weren't searching wildly. They were sweeping. The soldier felt the hair rise on his arms under the fabric of his sleeve. A sweeping patrol meant the enemy believed someone was here, or would be here. It meant the ground was being closed off methodically, like a net being drawn tight. The unit eased back deeper into cover, every man keeping his weight low. The sergeant's eyes met the soldier's for a moment, and in that brief exchange there was no need for words. They both understood the same ugly truth: their presence had been anticipated, or their timing had become predictable. The soldier's mind returned again to the small procedural slip, the identification marker set wrong enough to create hesitation, the skip check that seemed harmless. He imagined a friendly patrol seeing them earlier and holding fire just long enough for the enemy to notice movement. He imagined their route being reported, their shape being read incorrectly in the dim light. He imagined the mistake rippling outward, touching other decisions, turning small confusion into deadly clarity for the wrong side. The guilt came heavy, not as a dramatic wave but as a tightening pressure behind the ribs. In war, responsibility did not always match rank. Sometimes it settled on whoever had made the last choice, whoever had missed the last detail. The soldier had been trusted with the mechanics of safety, and he had failed quietly. He felt the urge to confess it immediately, to say it out loud and take whatever punishment came, but punishment was a luxury for later. Right now, guilt had to be swallowed and carried, like a stone in the stomach. The men around him depended on him to stay sharp, not to fall apart. They attempted another signal, this time more cautiously, using a method that should have been seen by friendly eyes if any were nearby. Again, nothing returned. The silence now felt deliberate. The soldier listened hard, and in the distance he thought he heard faint metallic clinks, equipment shifting, a buckle tapping against a rifle's sling. Then a lone murmur of voices, too far to make out words but close enough to confirm human presence. The enemy patrol was not alone. The net was tightening. The sergeant motioned for the unit to pull back toward a shallow ditch that ran along the edge of a field. The ditch was half filled with water and mud, and the smell of it was sharp and sour. They slid into it, crouching low, using the bank to hide their silhouettes. The soldier could feel cold water seeping into his trousers at the knee, and the discomfort sharpened his awareness. Across the field, the hedgerow on the far side looked like a wall. Beyond it, the land rose gently toward a cluster of trees. It was open ground, the kind that punished men who tried to cross it without smoke or cover. The soldier's eyes traced the line of the field, searching for any movement, any sign of enemy positions. He saw nothing, but he no longer trusted nothing. The sergeant weighed options in silence. The unit was small, lightly equipped, not meant for a fight against prepared positions. Their mission was to deliver orders, not to break through an enemy screen. But the enemy screen was now between them and both objectives, the forward element they were meant to reach, and the route back to safety. The soldier felt time slipping away, not in a dramatic countdown but in the slow fade of daylight, the creeping cold, the growing chance that night would make everything worse. In the dark, friend and foe blurred together. In the dark, mistakes multiplied. A man behind the soldier shifted, and the soldier heard the faint scrape of metal on metal. He turned sharply, eyes hard, and the man froze, apologetic without speaking. The sound seemed tiny, but in this environment, tiny sounds could travel like signals. The soldier's heart pounded again, and he forced himself to slow his breathing. He could feel sweat under his helmet despite the cold. His hands were steady, but only because he made them steady. The sergeant finally made a decision that followed procedure: hold position, wait for confirmation, avoid unnecessary movement. It was the safe choice on paper. It was what training demanded. But the soldier could feel the enemy presence growing, could sense the patrols shifting closer, their movements more confident. Procedure assumed time. Procedure assumed the enemy was not actively shaping the ground around you. The soldier stared at the field and thought of how quickly a small unit could be pinned, surrounded, and erased. He thought of the sealed orders still tucked away, of the forward element possibly waiting in ignorance, of the men beside him who trusted the chain of command to react in time. He knew, with a cold clarity that settled deep in his chest, that the chain of command might not react fast enough to save them. The pressure became physical. His throat felt tight. His jaw ached from clenching. He could hear his own pulse louder than the distant artillery. He wanted to believe the situation could still be handled cleanly, by the book, but the battlefield was no longer offering clean solutions. The mistake had bent the mission toward disaster, and now the unit stood at the edge of a decision that would define the next hour: follow the rules and risk being caught inside a closing net, or break them and gamble on survival with consequences they couldn't yet measure. The soldier's breath came faster now, shallow and controlled, a fragile rhythm held together by sheer force of will. The cold air bit at his lungs with every inhale, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline that filled his mouth. Around him, the unit was tense, every man wired tight with the knowledge that the ground beneath them had shifted from familiar to hostile, that every step forward might be the last. Communications had faltered hours before, radio silence stretched like a heavy curtain, broken only by faint crackles that conveyed nothing but static and uncertainty. Orders had come down before the patrol left, strict and clear, no unauthorized maneuvers, no deviations from the assigned path, no risks without command approval. But now, under the weight of creeping enemy presence and dwindling daylight, those orders felt less like guidance and more like chains. He glanced around quickly, catching the eyes of the sergeant, whose jaw was clenched tight. The sergeant's face betrayed a mixture of frustration and fear, but it was the soldier's decision to make. His training screamed at him to hold position, to wait for reinforcements, to follow protocol. Yet the instincts that had kept him alive through months of hardship whispered otherwise. The landscape around them, scarred by previous battles, offered no mercy. The narrow trails flanked by dense hedgerows and mud-soaked fields gave enemies countless places to lurk unseen. Time was compressing, daylight fading, enemy patrols tightening their net, and every moment of hesitation edged them closer to disaster. Without a word, the soldier broke formation, signaling with a flick of his hand a new direction, a course that cut across uncharted territory rather than the safer, more established paths marked on their maps. The men around him hesitated, the tension palpable as they weighed obedience against survival. Then, with slow nods, they followed. Their boots sank deep into the softened earth, leaving prints that were quickly erased by the steady drizzle that had begun to fall. Rain in the field was a double-edged sword. It muted sound but soaked men to the bone, sapping strength and morale alike. The soldier felt water seep through the collar of his uniform, chilling the skin beneath, but he welcomed the cloak of wetness if it meant masking their movement. Every step was calculated. The hedgerows, thick with brambles and thorn, scraped at uniforms and skin, leaving welts and stinging scratches that mingled with the dull aches from days on the move. The soldier's fingers, numb from cold and damp, clenched the rifle tighter, knuckles whitening. His eyes darted constantly, searching the shadows where the enemy might lie in wait. The scent of earth and leaves mixed with faint smoke from distant artillery shells, a reminder of the larger war raging beyond their small battlefield. The silence among the men was profound, broken only by the quiet squelch of mud beneath boots and the occasional whispered command. Breaking orders in wartime was no small thing. It could mean court-martial, disgrace, or worse. But here, in the tangled underbrush of Normandy's contested fields, rigid discipline was a luxury the situation no longer afforded. The soldier's gamble was born not of recklessness but necessity. He understood the fragility of their position, the razor-thin margin between escape and annihilation. World War II field operations were often decided by split-second choices, made in fog and fear, where a single misstep could trigger a cascade of deadly consequences. Friendly fire was a constant danger, as was falling into enemy ambushes or getting cut off from supply and support lines. The soldier's choice to move without clearance, to alter the plan mid-operation, was a desperate attempt to seize control of a spiraling situation. As they pressed forward, the terrain shifted beneath their feet. The muddy trail gave way to a shallow creek crossing, where icy water flowed sluggishly over rounded stones. The soldier motioned for caution, reminding the men to keep noise to a minimum. One slip could send a rifle crashing or a boot spraying water and alerting any nearby observers. He waited carefully, feeling the cold bite through his socks and into his boots, but the sting grounded him, sharpening his senses. On the far bank, the vegetation thinned, offering a brief respite before they entered an open field that stretched toward a line of distant trees. The field was a trap in itself, exposed and unforgiving, a place where a misstep could mean instant detection. His mind flicked to the sealed orders still tucked securely in his pack, the reason they had ventured into this perilous zone in the first place. The message was critical, commands that could shift the momentum of an ongoing engagement, but it meant nothing if they did not survive to deliver it. The soldier's thoughts spiraled briefly, torn between duty to the mission and responsibility for the men beside him. War was a calculus of sacrifice, and in moments like this, that balance tipped precariously. The decision to break protocol was not a surrender of discipline but an assertion of agency, an effort to rewrite the terms of their survival on their own terms. Movement picked up pace, the men slipping through shadows cast by overcast skies and skeletal branches. Every sound was magnified, the snap of a twig, the drip of rain from leaves, the rustle of wet fabric. The soldiers' ears tuned to the forest's subtle rhythms, searching for any anomaly that might betray enemy patrols. He spotted a flash of motion, a flicker of dark against dark, and froze. His hand rose slowly, signaling a halt. The unit pressed against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, breath held in suspended silence. The figure passed without notice, a lone German scout moving along a parallel path, unaware of their presence. The soldier's pulse hammered in his ears, a wild drumbeat that seemed to echo off the trees. They moved again, slower now, every step measured to avoid sound and sight. The rain grew heavier, smearing faces and soaking uniforms, but also washing away tracks that might lead pursuers. The soldier thought of how fragile these moments were, how quickly the tide of fortune could turn with the crack of a rifle or the snap of a branch. World War II was often a war of attrition, but attrition measured not just in numbers but in inches, seconds, and the smallest acts of courage or error. The soldier's gamble was a thread in that fabric, a narrow opening through a closing net that might be their only chance. As the path curved toward a wooded ridge, the soldier glanced back at his men, faces drawn and pale in the fading light, eyes sharp with exhaustion and resolve. There was no room for hesitation now, no place for second-guessing. The risk was immense, but the alternative was worse. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay their destination, the forward element waiting unknowingly, perhaps counting on their arrival. The soldier tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to lead his men through whatever lay ahead, knowing full well that survival depended as much on nerve as on orders. The battlefield had changed the rules, and he had chosen to change with it. The tension that had built over hours reached its crescendo as the unit pressed forward, moving through the thick underbrush and muddy fields with a desperation born from the knowledge that their time was running out. The enemy's presence, once a distant shadow on the edge of perception, had grown tangible. Patrols were closing in, their movements sharper, their intent unmistakable. The soldier who had broken protocol now bore the full weight of his decision, his every step a silent gamble against the unforgiving terrain and the invisible eyes watching from the shadows. The unit was no longer simply trying to complete a mission. They were fighting to avoid being swallowed whole by an enemy tightening its noose. The path they chose was fraught with peril, cutting through a narrow gap between a waterlogged ditch and a dense thicket of thorny bushes. The rain, which had begun as a light drizzle, now fell steadily, soaking uniforms and turning the earth beneath them into slick, treacherous mud. Every movement demanded care. One misstep could result in a stumble, a noise that might betray their position, or worse, a fall that left a man vulnerable and exposed. The soldier's hands ached from clutching his rifle so tightly, the muscles taut and trembling under cold and fatigue. His breath came in ragged bursts, the chill biting deep into his lungs, but there was no time to slow or rest. Despite the danger, the soldier's mind remained sharp, scanning the terrain ahead and behind, calculating the odds with the cold logic that combat demanded. They were crossing into open ground, a field that stretched out beneath a slate-gray sky, bordered by woods where enemy forces were known to patrol. This was the moment when any hesitation could mean disaster. The men moved in tight formation, rifles raised and eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, every flicker of light. The silence between them was a living thing, a fragile veil stretched thin by the tension of anticipation. The soldiers' thoughts flickered briefly to the orders tucked securely away, their original purpose now overshadowed by the immediate threat of survival. The war had never been kind to those caught between the ideal and the real, between what was planned and what was possible. This field, barren and exposed, was a crucible where theory gave way to brutal necessity. The soldier's decision to break the rules, once a distant possibility, had become the only viable option. It was a choice shaped by months of hardship, by the grim realities of a battlefield that favored no one, least of all those who hesitated. As they moved across the field, the first sign of enemy detection appeared, a sharp whistle, low and warning, cutting through the rain and stillness. It was followed by the unmistakable clatter of rifles being readied and boots pounding the earth. The enemy was closing fast, and the trap that had been slowly tightening snapped into place. The soldier's heart hammered as adrenaline surged, sharpening his senses even as exhaustion gnawed at his limbs. There was no time for fear. There was only action. He signaled for the men to split, to scatter in a pattern designed to confuse and delay the enemy's advance. The unit dispersed like shadows scattering in the fading light, each man taking cover behind broken fence posts, low stone walls, and clumps of dense shrubbery. The rain blurred the edges of their figures providing a thin veil of concealment. The soldier stayed low, his rifle raised, eyes darting from one dark shape to another, measuring distances and angles with a practiced gaze. The enemy's approach was methodical, relentless. Their voices carried faintly over the rain, commands barked in a language that the soldier knew well enough to anticipate their movements. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions, sending bursts of fire that rattled through the air and churned the mud beneath the men's feet. The soldier felt the shockwave of bullets passing close, the sting of splinters and leaves torn apart by lead. He fired back with steady hands, each shot deliberate and measured, knowing that wasted ammunition could mean death. In the chaos, the soldier's mind remained focused on one objective: to create an opening, however narrow, that might allow his comrades to slip through the enemy's grasp. It was a fragile hope, a thread stretched thin by the weight of circumstance. The unit had become a living puzzle, pieces scattered across a battlefield that was closing fast. The soldier moved with purpose, darting between cover, his every movement calculated to draw attention away from the others. The gamble paid off, if only barely. The enemy's line faltered, confused by the unexpected resistance and the sudden fragmentation of the unit. Seconds stretched into minutes as the soldier's desperate maneuvering bought precious time. His comrades took advantage of the hesitation, slipping through the gaps, melting into the rain and shadow. It was not a clean escape. There were close calls, whispered curses, and the weight of lost chances. But it was enough. As the enemy regrouped and pressed forward, the soldier made one final push, breaking through a thinning line of fire to rejoin the last of his unit. His body ached with every step, muscles screaming in protest, lungs burning with cold air. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his uniform was soaked through, heavy with mud and water. Yet there was a grim satisfaction in survival, a recognition that this day had not ended in death. The aftermath was a quiet reckoning. The unit gathered in a small copse of trees, weapons lowered but eyes still sharp. The soldier's decision to break orders was an unspoken shadow between them. The sergeant met his gaze with a look that was neither accusation nor forgiveness, but understanding, the weight of command and the burden of impossible choices. The war had no room for absolutes. Doing the right thing often meant breaking the rules written for safer times and conditions. In the days that followed, the soldier faced scrutiny and reflection. The error that had set the trap, the gamble that had saved them, both lingered in memory like scars beneath the skin. The chain of command demanded answers, accountability tempered by the recognition that survival in war was rarely clean or heroic. The mission had been salvaged, but at a cost that no metal could measure. This story was not just about a single unit, or a solitary decision. It was a reflection of the larger truth of World War II, a conflict shaped not only by sweeping strategies and grand battles but by ordinary soldiers making impossible decisions under crushing pressure. Where one quiet mistake nearly ended everything, and one forbidden choice, born of desperation and resolve, prevented catastrophe. The aftermath of this operation was neither triumphant nor clean. The soldier who broke orders saved lives but also carried the burden of responsibility for a near disaster. His choice forced commanders to reckon with the harsh reality that the rules written for controlled environments often failed on the chaotic front lines. This incident was not unique. Across countless battlefields, soldiers faced impossible decisions, where the right course was blurred by urgency and survival. World War II was shaped not just by generals and grand strategies but by these moments, small, quiet, and wrenching, where ordinary men made extraordinary choices under pressure. This story reminds us that behind every headline or victory lies a complex tapestry of human error, courage, and the raw struggle to live another day in the shadow of war. Discover the untold sacrifices that shaped history. Subscribe to WWII Impact, where every story changes the way you see World War II.